David over at the sawmill gave me this disc, which I think came off of a planter. I've made a knife out of this metal, and it's really good and hard, and it tempers good. And what I'm going to do now is torch out 4 drop point hunters, and then I've got a little oddball knife I just drew out there with the chalk. There's the blades after I torched them out, but they're not quite loose yet. I'll have to take a hammer and knock those out of there. That metal's so hard it kind of wells back as you cut. You can see I've got 6 blades kind of roughed out there. Here's the roughed out knife blades. I took a hammer and knocked them out of the disc. Now I need to remove some of that slag off, well, both sides actually, with a coarse grit belt. Here's the blades that I roughed out, knocked them out of the disc. Then I went over to the belt sander with a 40 grit, really coarse belt, cleaned up both sides. Some of them are pitted more than others. I figured that disc was buried in the ground for a period of time, number of years or something. And the one for this project I'm going to use it'll be the blank on the far right there. And those get these blades kind of laid in there the way I want. About 3 of them I've got the tang backed up in there, and the blade part sticking out here. I'm not trying to make these knives perfect. They're just kind of fun knives to build, and I want them to turn out unique and pretty slick. But one of those little blades right here. Now I'm going to the lime bag over there. I've got a 50-pound bag of lime. Here's a shot of the blades after I pulled them out of the lime. Kind of washed them off a little bit. This one down here on the bottom is the one I'm going to profile first. Okay, I scribed around the pattern, and then I came in there with my center punch and center punched those holes right there for the pins that will be holding the handles on. I'm drilling a 1/8 inch hole right now, kind of as a pilot hole, and then I'll come back with a 3/16 drill bit and drill this out. I'm going to put 3/16 inch pins here, and then at the very back of the tang there, I'm going to put a lanyard hole there for a leather string. Got a little layout die on both sides of the blade right here, and I've taken my calipers here and scratched a line right in the center of this blade on the cutting edge part, and I've marked a 1/4 inch down, scribed a line right there on both sides. And what I'll do now is put an initial grind on there, and then do a little hollow grinding. But first of all, I want to get that first cut in there on each side, so the cutting edge will be right down the center. Here's a piece of elk horn. I kind of dug around. I've got 2 or 3 pieces, and what I'm going to do is cut this out about right here, put a mark right there and up past these two little holes right there, and then I'll cut that off right there and then split it down the middle. Now I've got the backup platen on my grinder here, and what I'll do is surface these handles till they fit on the knife tang like they should. Got a Norton Narzon Plus belt on there, the 2x72, and it's an 80 grit. Got the grind in the blade the way I want. Gave it a hologram grind, then came back and kind of flat grinded it a little bit, smoothed up everything. Now I'm going to stick this in the propane forwards and get from here out just red hot cherry red, and then come over here, and I've got my 2 name stamps I'm going to put on the blade, stamp it in there while it's hot. These are stamps that I've actually retired. They're not my stamps that I use for cold steel, but I'll stamp my mark in there, and then check for straightness on the blade, on the anvil face here, and if need be, if it's cooled down a little bit too much, I'll put it back in the forwards, and I've got some olive oil right here, and that's what I'm going to quench the blade in. And I'll go in a manner like this and not sideways. Sideways sometimes tends to warp the blade. Okay, it's time to quench the blade now. Turn that off. Stick that right down in that olive oil. There we go. Here's the blade after I pulled it out of the stove. Set in there for an hour at 550. Let it cool just a little bit. Then I put it on this plate and brought it out here to the shop. I've got the handles kind of a mock-up on here. Cut my pins out of the brass brazing rod. I will soften those a little bit with the torch, and then quench those in water and soften a little bit so I can brad those heads on each side. I've pretty well got these pins pre-flared on one side and fitted to the knife handles. This side will need peening a little more. I've got a little stirring stick here I made out of a 1/16 inch welding rod. You can use anything you want. And here's the hammer that I'll use to peen the pins, and I'll be using Loctite epoxy. I'll put out equal parts on this cardboard, and I don't want to have so much glue or epoxy. I don't want it running out everywhere. A little bit's okay, but it's really hard to clean it off this stag if it gets all over it. So the idea here is to try to be real neat, and you've got 5 to 8 minutes before that starts setting up. that's okay. It'd probably take a few more minutes than that to get the pins riveted. And right here I'll use a center punch. I've got one that's worked down a little bit. That one right there, I'll just tap that slightly on the anvil, and that will flare that, so that will lock that in between there. Switched hammers right there. When you're peening those pins, just use a light touch, and that works out the best way. Make sure your pin is right on the anvil face, and just tap those pins very lightly to flare them out. The knife and the sheath are now completed. This rig is ready to go hunting.